They say power never disappears. It only waits for the next man bold enough to grab it. And on the morning of July 7th, 1968, power was suddenly up for sale in Harlem. At 6:47 a.m., a phone rang inside a small apartment in Manhattan. The man who answered didn't say hello. He already knew bad news never waits for greetings. 2 words came through the receiver: "He's gone." That was it. No explanation. No emotion. No mercy. Frank Lucas stood frozen, the phone still pressed to his ear even after the line went dead. His eyes stared at the wall. But his mind was somewhere else, back on the streets of Harlem, back in smoke-filled rooms. Back beside the one man who had kept him alive for 15 years, Bumpy Johnson was dead. The undisputed ruler of Harlem, the man who shook hands with politicians and stared down the Italian Mafia, the man who taught Frank Lucas everything. A heart attack, they said. Just collapsed while eating breakfast. 62 years old. No warning. No final words. No chance to prepare. Frank slowly sat on the edge of his bed. For a long moment, he didn't move. This wasn't just the death of a boss. This was the death of a shield. Because Frank Lucas understood something most people didn't. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a king. He was the balance. As long as Bumpy was alive, Harlem had rules. Order, boundaries. With him gone, chaos was coming. Frank's wife Eva stepped into the room. One look at his face, and she knew something was wrong. "Frank, what happened?" He swallowed hard. "Bumpy's gone." Eva's hand flew to her mouth. Oh, God. But Frank didn't respond. He wasn't grieving yet. He was calculating. Because in Frank Lucas's world, grief came later. Survival came first. Here's what nobody outside the streets understood yet. Bumpy Johnson's death created a vacuum worth nearly $50 million a year. Heroin routes, numbers, rackets, protection money, political favors, police payoffs, and every predator in New York could smell it. The Italians, the Irish, the Jewish syndicates, the rising black gangs, they were all coming, and every single one of them believed the same thing. Harlem was finally theirs. No one, not one gangster, was thinking about Frank Lucas to them. Frank was invisible. Bumpy's driver. The quiet guy who opened doors. The man who carried bags, picked up suits, waited in cars. 15 years standing next to a king, and still nobody saw him. That invisibility had kept Frank alive now. It was about to become his weapon. Frank stood up and began getting dressed slowly, deliberately. Eva watched him, confused. "Where are you going?" "To the bank," she frowned. "The bank. Frank, it's barely morning. I need to make a withdrawal." Eva hesitated. "How much?" Frank turned and looked at her. "All of it." 3 hours later, Frank Lucas walked out of Chase Manhattan Bank, carrying a plain black briefcase. Inside, it was $100,000 in cash. In 1968. That kind of money wasn't just rare, it was dangerous. Adjusted for today, it was close to $1 million. Every dollar Frank had saved over 15 years. No flashy cars. No diamonds. No wild nights. While other gangsters spent to be seen. Frank saved to be ready. Eva waited in the car, her hands gripping the steering wheel. "Frank," she whispered as he got in, "what are you doing?" "I'm going to Bumpy's funeral." "With that," she said, glancing at the briefcase, "you can't do this. Someone could rob you, kill you." Frank looked straight ahead. "Baby, today every killer in New York will be in one room." He paused. "And if I'm walking into that room, I'm not walking in like a servant." He finally turned to her. "I'm walking in like a king." Da-da-da. Funeral was held at Abyssinian Baptist Church, the biggest church in Harlem. Over 2,000. People packed the building. Community leaders, politicians, street soldiers, men who feared Bumpy, men who owed him their lives, and in the front rows, wearing tailored suits and cold expressions, sat the mob. The Italian bosses, the black kingpins, the men already planning how to divide. Harlem, once the body hit the ground, they whispered to each other confidently. This was their moment. Then the doors opened. Frank Lucas walked in latent purpose. Black suit, black tie, black fedora, and in his hand, the briefcase. At first, people barely noticed him. Oh, that's just Bumpy's driver. But Frank didn't take a seat. He didn't bow his head. He walked straight down the aisle toward the casket. Step by step, the whispers stopped. Frank placed the briefcase gently on the floor beside Bumpy Johnson's body. Then slowly he opened it. What happened next would change Harlem forever. Frank reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills. $10,000. He placed it directly on Bumpy's chest. A murmur rippled through the church. Then Frank pulled out another stack, and another dot, and another 10 stacks. $100,000 in cash sitting on a dead man's body. The room went silent. No coughing, no whispers, no movement. 2,000 people stared in disbelief, because nobody did this. Not for family, not for friends, not even for kings. Then Frank Lucas turned around and he spoke. My name is Frank Lucas. His voice didn't shake. For 15 years, I worked for Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. He paused, letting the name settle. And Bumpy taught me one thing above everything else. Frank gestured to the casket. He said, in this life, you're either somebody or you're nobody. He looked around the room, locking eyes with killers, bosses, men who ruled cities. This man was somebody. The greatest somebody Harlem has ever known. Frank's voice hardened, and when a king dies, you don't send him into the ground empty-handed. The money sat there, impossible to ignore. This is what respect looks like. And Frank did something no one expected. He pointed. First at the Italians. You think you're taking Harlem? Then at the black gangsters. You think it's your turn? He shook his head. You're all wrong. The church erupted. Men stood up. Voices shouted. Threats filled the air. Frank didn't move. Bumpy didn't leave Harlem to any of you, he said calmly. He left it to me. Gasps, shouts, rage. Someone yelled, you're nobody. Frank smiled slightly. I was... No. He tapped the casket. Now I'm not. Silence fell again, but this time it was different. This time it was fear, because Frank Lucas had just done something impossible. He had challenged every criminal power in New York and backed it up with 100,000 reasons why they should take him seriously. Frank leaned in one last time toward Bumpy's body. Rest easy. Boss, he whispered. I got it from here. Then he closed the briefcase and walked out of the church behind him. Every man inside was asking the same terrifying question. If Frank Lucas could throw away that kind of money, how dangerous was he really? And that's where part one ends. Because next comes the aftermath. The phone calls. The threats, and a meeting with the Mafia that would decide whether Frank Lucas walked away alive or didn't walk away at all. Frank Lucas didn't breathe easy until the church doors closed behind him. Outside, Harlem looked the same, cars passing, people talking, kids running on sidewalks, but Frank knew the truth. Everything had changed. He got into the car beside Eva. His hands were trembling. Not from fear, but from the adrenaline still burning through his body. Eva stared straight ahead. Her voice was low, controlled. Frank, what did you just do? He leaned back in the seat. I made it impossible for them to ignore me. She finally turned to him. You didn't just make noise. You painted a target on your chest. The Italians. Nicky Barnes. Every man in that church wants you dead. Frank lit a cigarette. His hands steady now. Not today. Eva shook her head. How can you be so sure? Frank exhaled smoke slowly, because every gangster in that room is asking the same question. He glanced at her. If I can throw away $100,000 in public, how much do you think they believe I really have? Eva said nothing. That uncertainty, Frank continued, that hesitation. That buys me time. They drove home in silence. But silence didn't last long as soon as Frank stepped inside his apartment. The phone rang. He stared at it. Eva whispered, "Don't answer." Frank picked it up anyway. "Frank Lucas." A heavy voice came through the line. "Calm, controlled, dangerous. This is Carmine." Ash. Frank's blood cooled instantly. Carmine Tremonti, acting boss of the Lucchese crime family? One of the 5 men who truly ran New York? "I figured you'd call," Frank replied. A pause. "You got nerve?" "Kid, I learned from Bumpy." Another pause, longer this time. "We need to talk." "About what?" "You know exactly about what," Carmine said. "Tonight, 8 o'clock, Ralph's restaurant. Come alone." The line went dead. Eva stared at Frank. "Who was that?" "The Mafia." Her face drained of color. "You're not going. I have to." "Frank, if I don't show," he said quietly, "they'll assume I'm scared. And the moment they believe that, I'm finished." That night, Frank Lucas walked into Ralph's restaurant. It was a small place den, tables at most, but power filled the room. Thicker than cigarette smoke. The restaurant was empty except for one table. Carmine sat there, with 4 men standing behind him. No smiles. No wasted movement. Frank walked over and sat down without asking. Carmine studied him. "You don't look nervous." "I don't scare easy." Carmine chuckled. "That'll get you killed in this business." Frank shrugged. "So does fear." Wine was poured. Carmine leaned back. "Let's get something straight. Bumpy had an arrangement with us. He ran Harlem. We took our cut. 20%. That's how things stayed peaceful." "That was Bumpy's deal," Frank replied. "Not mine." Carmine's smile faded. "You stood up in a church full of made men and said that deal was over?" "I stated a fact." Carmine leaned forward. "You're either brave or suicidal." Frank met his gaze. "I'm practical." Silence stretched. "And what makes you think," Carmine said slowly, "you can hold Harlem without our permission?" Frank leaned in. "Because Harlem doesn't belong to you." The guards stiffened. "It belongs to the people who live there," Frank continued. "They trusted Bumpy. They saw me beside him for 15 years. They watched me send him off like royalty." Frank tapped the table lightly. "You walk into Harlem, they see outsiders. I walk in, they see one of their own." Carmine studied him carefully. "And the money," he said. "That stunt you pulled. Where did it come from?" "I saved it." Carmine laughed. "No offense, kid, but drivers don't save that kind of money." "Drivers who listen do," Frank replied. "While everyone else was spending to impress, I was watching, learning." Carmine took a sip of wine. "So now you're broke." Frank smiled. "No, I'm invested." They earned him a slow nod. "You're smarter than I expected," Carmine admitted. "Here's what's going to happen." Frank waited. "I'll give you 6 months." 6 months for what?" "To prove you're not bluffing." Carmine's tone hardened. "You keep Harlem quiet. You make money? No chaos. No headlines. No problems that land on my desk. And if I succeed, then we respect your independence. And if I don't?" Carmine didn't hesitate. "We take everything." Frank extended his hand. "Deal." They shook as Frank stood to leave. Carmine spoke again. "One more thing." Frank turned. "You embarrassed a lot of powerful people today," Carmine said. "Don't confuse tolerance with friendship." Frank nodded. "I wouldn't dream of it." Frank walked out into the night knowing too. Things first, he had bought time. Second, everyone expected him to fail, and failure in this game didn't mean bankruptcy. It meant a body in the street. 3 days later, the tests began. Nicky Barnes made the first move. Barnes was flashy, loud, loved attention. Everything Frank was not. Nicky walked into one of Frank's heroin spots and told the dealers the truth as he saw it. "Frank Lucas is finished." Nicky said, "You work for me now." Word reached Frank within hours. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He didn't send soldiers. That night, Frank went alone. He knocked on Nicky Barnes's door. Nicky opened it, confused. "Frank." The gun came up instantly, cold steel against Nicky's forehead. "You made a mistake," Frank said calmly. Nicky laughed nervously. "You bluffing?" Frank cocked the hammer. The click echoed through the hallway. "I put $100,000 in a coffin," Frank whispered. "You think I'm scared of pulling a trigger?" Nicky's smile vanished. Frank leaned in. "You got two choices. You work with me, or you disappear." Silence. Finally, Nicky swallowed. "I'll work with you." Frank lowered the gun. Smart. That night, Frank made a decision that changed the drug game forever. Nicky Barnes would be the face. The headlines. The rumors. The reputation. Frank Lucas would be the shadow. Invisible. Untouchable. Unknown. Because Frank understood something most gangsters never learned. Fame attracts bullets. Silence attracts money. But Frank still had a problem. The Italians controlled the supply, and as long as they did, Frank Lucas was never truly king. So he decided to do something no one had ever done before. He cut them out completely in 1969. Frank Lucas boarded a plane. Not to Miami, not to Vegas, but to Southeast Asia, Bangkok, Vietnam, the Golden Triangle, the source. While other dealers fought over scraps, Frank went straight to where the product was born. He negotiated directly. No middlemen. No taxes. No permission. Pure product. Dirt cheap prices, and then he created a pipeline no one dared touch. Sealed coffins. Fallen soldiers. Untouchable cargo. When the first shipment arrived in New York, Frank named it Blue Magic, and Harlem had never seen anything like it. Within months, dealers switched sides. Customers lined up. Money poured in quietly, efficiently, deadly. 6 months passed. Then Carmine called again. "How are you doing this?" he asked. Frank smiled into the phone. "I stopped thinking like a gangster." He said, "I started thinking like a businessman." And that's where part 2 ends. Because in part 3, Frank Lucas doesn't just survive. He takes over 80% of Harlem, makes $1 million a day, and becomes richer than the Mafia itself. 6 months. That was the time Carmine Tremonti had given Frank Lucas to prove himself. 6 months to either become the most powerful man in Harlem or end up another name whispered on street corners. By the time those 6 months were over, Frank Lucas wasn't just surviving, he was winning. Quietly, relentlessly, invisibly. The streets of Harlem changed almost overnight. Dealers noticed it first. The product was different, stronger, cleaner, unmistakable. One hit told you everything you needed to know. Customers started asking a single question at every corner. "Y'all got that blue magic?" Frank's heroin was nearly pure, so pure that it barely needed cutting. What others stretched 10 times before selling. Frank could cut 9 times and still deliver something better. That meant 2 things. First, customers came back. Second, profits exploded. Frank sold cheaper than everyone else and still made more money than anyone in New York within weeks. Entire blocks switched allegiance. Within months, Harlem belonged to him, but Frank never showed up. No flashy entrances. No bodyguards. No speeches. Nicky Barnes handled the noise. Nicky wore the fur coats. Nicky sat front row. Nicky soaked up the attention. Frank stayed behind the curtain, running numbers, tightening systems, controlling every dollar, because Frank Lucas didn't want a crew. He wanted a machine. Here's how. Frank did what the Mafia never could. He paid salaries, no percentages, no partnerships, no power dash sharing. Everyone from street dealers to couriers worked for Frank-like employees. Weekly pay. Clear rules. No confusion. That meant no ambition. Because ambition gets people killed. Nobody could steal thee. Operation because nobody understood the whole. Operation. Frank was the only one who knew how everything connected. The supply, the routes, the money. If someone disappeared, the machine kept moving. By the end of 1969, Frank Lucas controlled 80% of Harlem's heroin trade. He had over 250 people working for him, and he was making $1 million a day. Cash-filled basements. Suitcases stacked high. Banks couldn't explain it. The Italians noticed, and they were furious. Carmine called. Frank back to Ralph's, same table. Same restaurant, different tone. "You're costing us money," Carmine said. Frank shrugged. "Competition does that." "We've been in this business 50 years, Carmine snapped. "And suddenly we can't move product in Harlem." Frank leaned back calmly. "Because you're still buying from France," he said. "And you're paying too much for garbage?" Carmine narrowed his eyes. "So where's yours coming from?" Frank smiled but didn't answer. "That's the problem," Carmine continued. "We don't know how you're doing this. No ports, no docks, no customs hits." Frank sipped his drink. "That's because you're watching the wrong doors." Silence hung between them. "You're smarter than Bumpy," Carmine admitted finally. Frank shook his head. "No, Bumpy taught me something more important than power." "What's that?" "Visibility is a weakness." Frank kept his promise. He didn't expand into Brooklyn. Didn't he touch Queens? Didn't challenge the Mafia. Directly he stayed in Harlem, and he printed. Money, but success has a side effect. It makes people careless, and even the most disciplined man can slip just once. March 8th, 1971. Madison Square Garden, the fight of the century. Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier. Every celebrity, every politician, every gangster. Frank Lucas sat ringside with Eva, and for the first time in years, Frank wanted to be seen. He wore a chinchilla coat, floor length, jet black, worth $50,000. The kind of coat that screamed wealth, the kind of coat Frank had always avoided. Eva touched his arm. "Frank, this isn't you," he smiled. "One night won't hurt." Across the arena, a detective noticed the coat. His name was Richie Roberts, and in that moment, everything began to unravel. Roberts didn't know Frank Lucas, but he knew one thing. Nobody earns that kind of money legally. The next morning, he started asking questions. Slowly, quietly, watching, following, connecting dots. It took years, but piece by piece, the invisible empire became visible. And when the door finally crashed open in 1975, Frank Lucas understood the truth. Bumpy had warned him. The moment you want people to know you're rich, you're finished. And that's where part 3 ends. Because in part 4, Frank Lucas faces prison, betrayal, and the decision that saves his life but destroys his legend. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. For 5 years, Frank Lucas was untouchable. From 1969 to 1974, Harlem had a new king, but one who never wanted the crown. The streets whispered his name, dealers feared him, and the Italians were forced to respect him. Every move he made was calculated. Every dollar accounted for. He owned buildings, cars, and businesses. He had a loyal crew. He was untouchable. But one mistake, one moment of vanity, would change everything. March 8th, 1971. Madison Square Garden. The arena was alive with tension. Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier, history in the making. Celebrities, politicians, gangsters, every powerful figure in New York watched. Frank Lucas, always the invisible man, sat ringside in a $50,000 chinchilla. Coat. Floor length. Expensive, flashy, loud. The kind of coat that didn't whisper power, it shouted it across the arena. A man's eyes fixed on him. Detective Richie Roberts, of the Essex County Prosecutor's Office. He'd been hearing whispers of Frank Lucas for 2 years. But this coat was proof. Nobody makes that kind of money legally. Nobody wears a coat like that unless a drug dealer. And just like that, The hunter became the hunted. Roberts didn't act immediately. He followed, observed, collected pieces. Every call, every shipment, every ledger. Slowly, methodically, a case was built. It took 4 years or years of surveillance, wiretaps, and informants. Then, in 1975, the law caught up. A raid. Frank Lucas's mansion in Tanafly, New Jersey. Cash stacked high. Heroin stored and hidden. Ledgers documenting the empire he had built. $584,000 in cash. Enough heroin to shut down a city block for months. Frank Lucas, king of Harlem, untouchable for years. Arrested, as he sat in the jail cell, Frank understood what had happened. He remembered Bumpy's warning. Frank, the moment you want people to know you're rich, you're finished. Stay invisible. Stay quiet. The silent man lives, the loud man dies. He'd stayed silent for 5 years, building an empire worth over $100 million, and yet, one moment of pride a coat that screamed wealth was enough to undo it all. But Frank Lucas had one card left to play. He picked up the phone. "I want a deal," he said. "What kind of deal?" The officer asked. "I'll tell you everything. Every operation. Every supplier. The Mafia. Corrupt cops. The entire pipeline." There was silence. "You'll give us the biggest corruption case in New York history," Roberts finally said. Frank smiled. "Exactly. But I want something to reduce time. Protection." And that's how Frank Lucas became an informant. Frank's cooperation was legendary. He testified against over 100 people. Mafia bosses, including those who had once eyed his empire. Corrupt NYPD officers, including members of the Special Investigations Unit, the most corrupt squad in the department. Dealers, middlemen, and anyone involved in the French Connection ring. His testimony destroyed organized crime. Structures in New York. And it wasn't just the Mafia. Frank exposed police corruption at the highest levels, changing the way the city approached law enforcement. The courts were harsh but fair. Frank was sentenced to 70 years. But because of his cooperation, his sentence was reduced to 15 years. He served 7 and walked free. In 1981, Harlem had changed. The drug game had changed. And Frank Lucas was no longer king. By the 1980s, the streets he once ruled were full of new players. Violence had escalated. The crack epidemic began to spread chaos. Frank Lucas tried to go straight. He spoke to kids. Sharing the mistakes he had made, he tried to guide them away from the life he had lived. He consulted for films, like American Gangster 2007, where Denzel Washington portrayed his story on the big screen. And then, in 2019, Frank Lucas passed away at the age of 88, of natural causes. In his sleep, the question remains, was Frank Lucas a hero or a villain? The truth is, he was both. He ruined lives, destroyed communities, and flooded Harlem with heroin. He also outsmarted the Mafia, built a criminal empire from nothing, and exposed corruption at the highest levels. He proved that a man from North Carolina with nothing could rise, even in a world stacked against him, and that $100,000 he placed in Bumpy Johnson's casket. That wasn't just respect. That was a strategic move, an investment in his future. A statement to the world, I am nobody no longer. Even decades later, people remember that day, Frank Lucas, carrying a briefcase, walking into Abyssinian Baptist Church, standing before 2,000 witnesses, and stacking $100,000 in cash on a casket. He didn't just honor Bumpy Johnson. He claimed a throne, showing that boldness can create legends. Frank's story teaches something vital about power. Real power isn't loud. Real power is invisible. When you make noise to prove your strength, you invite destruction. Silence, patience, and strategy create empires. Frank stayed quiet for 5 years, untouchable, unseen, unstoppable. Then he got loud and lost everything yet. Even in failure, he remains legendary because the $100,000 in the casket wasn't just money, It was respect, influence, legacy, proof that a nobody can become a somebody, as Frank Lucas once said. I learned from Bumpy that you can't be half a gangster. You either go all the way, or you don't go at all. I went all the way. He paid for it. But for 5 unforgettable years, he was king of Harlem, king of audacity, king of strategy. So when you think about Frank Lucas, don't just think about drugs or money. Think about the boldest moves in history. The risks, the strategy, and the lessons he left behind. Respect is priceless. Power is invisible until it's too late. And sometimes, the smartest move is the one no one else can even imagine. Frank Lucas didn't just rewrite the rules. He redefined them. And the legend of that funeral, that briefcase, and that $100,000 lives forever. Rest in peace. Frank Lucas, 1930 to 2019, the man who walked into a church, changed the game, and proved that sometimes boldness is the ultimate power. If this story taught you anything about respect, strategy, and the cost of power, hit that like button, because Frank Lucas wasn't just a gangster. He was a lesson in audacity, a masterclass in claiming your place in a world that never expected you to rise. The end of the empire. The beginning of the legend.